Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. It's my pleasure, truly my pleasure, to welcome back Watson Senior Fellow and Ambassador Chaz Freeman. Some of you have participated in Chaz's earlier lecture series. Some of you are new. For those of you who have participated, you know you're in for a really a great intellectual treat. And for those of you who are new, you will find out for yourselves. Chaz is going to deliver 3 lectures. Today is the first, the second will be on April 5th, and the third on April 12th. April 17th. The first lecture, Diplomacy as Strategy, will be followed by a second lecture on Diplomacy as Tactics, and a third lecture in the series on Diplomacy as Risk Management. Let me very briefly review Chaz's biography for those of you who are not familiar with it. Chaz has had a distinguished career as a career diplomat, serving across numerous administrations, Republican and Democratic. Chaz was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs from 1993 to 1994, in an extremely important post-Cold War moment when the entire European security system was being reconstituted and reconfigured, as were military relations with China. That happened during the Clinton administration. Previous to that, Chaz had served as U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia during Desert Shield and Desert Storm. That was the George H.W. Bush administration. Prior to that, Chaz was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs during the whole period of U.S. mediation of Namibian independence from South Africa and Cuban withdrawal from Angola. That will be mentioned in today's discussion, and that happened during the Reagan administration. Chaz, prior to that, was DCM, the Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires in the American embassies in Bangkok, and prior to that in Beijing, also during the Reagan administration, the first term. Almost there, prior to that, Chaz, and I'm only mentioning just small pieces of an incredible career. Chaz was Director for Chinese Affairs at the State Department during the late Carter and early Reagan administrations, and prior to that, as many of you know, Chaz had served as Principal American Interpreter during President Nixon's famous 1972 trip to China, the great opening to China. In addition to, of course, this distinguished career, Chaz has played a rather extraordinary role since departing the Foreign Service, a role I don't know exactly how to describe it, gadfly, public provocateur, but mostly just incredible geopolitical thinker. We've been extremely fortunate at the Watson Institute at Brown generally to be able to be witness to this thinking, to participate in it, and to have you here as really an instructor and a faculty member. So Chaz, let me turn it over to you. I have to apologize because I'm going to have to leave slightly early at 5:15, so if you'll forgive me, I'm going to hide in the back of the room and turn over everything to you, Chaz.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ed. It is a pleasure to see some familiar faces and some new ones. I think I am probably far from the only American who's deeply concerned about the consequences of the ongoing gutting of our diplomatic establishment. I anticipate that once we Americans have destroyed the Department of State and the United States Foreign Service as well, we will have to reinvent them. And they can, after all, they can be essential tools of statecraft that guide and complement our armed forces, make their use unnecessary, or translate their victories into new and stable relationships with the defeated. A reconstruction of these institutions to meet the new challenges before us will be a lengthy process, but I believe we should not wait to prepare for it. We will need to train a whole new generation of American diplomats to levels of professionalism comparable to those of our very professional armed services. In the meantime, we should learn by observing others, like the Chinese, who, far from abandoning diplomacy as their preferred method of advancing their national interests, have just doubled their budget for it. We cut ours by 30%. Elect a clown, expect a circus. But the damage we are now doing to our alliances, our economic and other international relationships, and ourselves is not my topic today. I will speak mainly in terms of military aspects of strategy, but just about everything I say can equally well apply to economic and political strategy. I'm a retired practitioner of diplomacy. I believe we can and should distill operational doctrine from experience. Diplomacy is the regulation of international relationships through the control of perceptions. In this talk, I will cite practical applications of diplomacy to strategy. Before I do this, however, I need to prepare the terrain by defining a few terms and describing where each of them fits in the catalog of statecraft. To formulate sound diplomatic strategy, one must first assure that the words one applies to foreign relations both correspond to reality and are relevant to analysis, deliberation, and planning. I propose to discuss 4 categories of relationship that include or imply obligations: alliances, ententes, protectorates, and client states in this context. How do each of these categories of relationship relate to strategy? Well, a strategy is a plan of action designed to achieve a desired objective through the lowest possible investment of effort, resources, and time, and the fewest possible adverse consequences for oneself. In chess, a strategy that consists only of an opening move consistently yields failure. Myopic moves in foreign policy, moves that do not anticipate the probable perceptions and counter moves of others, also guarantee defeat. The American invasions of both Afghanistan and Iraq were just such exuberant assaults with no planned follow-up, definition of victory, or concept for war termination, and they haven't ended. Calling a statement or a collection of military campaign plans a strategy does not make it one. Strategies cannot be wishful thinking. They must match resources to objectives and focus on specific obtainable objectives. Diplomacy is an essential part of any international strategy. It involves molding the decisions and actions of others to one's advantage, as well as making one's own moves. It's a protracted game that is almost rule-free, far more complex than chess, and has real-world consequences. The U.S. National Security Strategy and its companion National Defense Strategy, released respectively in December 2017 and January 2018, assign no specific resources to feasible objectives and specify no steps by which the belligerent approach they outline can be implemented. They are unaffordable military bravado attached to no strategy. They aggravate rather than cure the U.S. national strategy deficit. No one can play chess without understanding the capabilities and potential uses of the various pieces on the board, both on one's own side and on that of one's opponent. Knights move differently and do things that bishops and pawns can't, and vice versa. Each piece must be deployed or countered differently. The same is true in foreign affairs, with the added complications that the contest has actions other than attack and defend, that one sort of peace can at any moment change into another, that there are often multiple players maneuvering independently but simultaneously in the same space, and that even when the king is cornered, the game doesn't end. It just enters a new phase. The atrophy of diplomatic vocabulary during the Cold War has dimmed appreciation of the relationships and the balances of capabilities between relevant international actors, between them and one's own nation, and between them and one's competitors. Today, almost the only words used to describe any sort of remotely cooperative international ties, however ephemeral, is ally or alliance. These words have been so stretched, shop-worn, and blurred in meaning that they've become semantic nulls. They dull both vision and reason, contributing nothing but confusion to analysis or planning. An ally is a partner that's accepted an obligation to offer broad support or assistance to one's nation because it wishes to receive reciprocal support for its own interests and objectives. The usual purpose of alliance is to add the power of others to one's own. But the so-called pactomania that followed Americans' post-World War II abandonment of George Washington's long-respected warning against entangling alliances did not conform to this model. The United States embarked on a protective mission directed at denying our newly established sphere of influence to our Soviet adversary and its apparent Chinese auxiliary. Security guarantees to others became part of a strategy of containment and deterrence, not one focused on power aggregation. There was little, if any, expectation that Europeans in NATO, the West Asians in CENTO, the Southeast Asians in CETO, or Northeast Asians like the rump Chinese state on Taiwan, occupied Japan, or South Korea, would add much, if anything, at all, to the military or economic capabilities of the United States. These U.S. allies, in quotes, had been made poor and weak by history or by war. They had nothing but their territory, strategic independence, and past prestige to contribute to the struggle with the Soviet Union and its satrapies. The United States made them allies to bring them under its protection for purposes of strategic denial. They were not national security assets, but liabilities, insured by American power in a game in which they were pawns. They were not so much ramparts as tripwires, designed to change the risk calculus of the Soviet enemy. In this context, assessments of the balance of benefits and risks of alliances were frankly beside the point. The Cold War ended in 1989 or 1991, somewhere in there. But this peculiar history continues to shape American thinking about alliances and allies. The American people view foreign policy largely as being about Americans nobly safeguarding U.S. allies from their enemies, who are, by extension and adoption, our enemies too. Any nation not overtly hostile to the United States and in some way cooperative with it can be called a so-called ally worthy of American protection. But the impulse to vindicate national honor by defending allies coexists with the suspicion that they may be playing America for a sucker. Hence the inherent appeal of the populist demand that allies reimburse the United States for protecting them, especially now that they've returned to wealth and power, while America declines in both. But if Americans aspire to be something other than global mercenaries, we must ask first, now that the collapse of the Soviet enemy has made strategic denial to it of these countries irrelevant, what's in it for the United States to protect them at all? Second, what responsibility should so-called allies have to protect themselves? And third, what can or should allies be asked to contribute to U.S. national security in addition to their own? The answers to these questions, which Mr. Trump appeared to ask during the election campaign, but seems to have forgotten, the answers to these questions depend to a considerable extent on assessments of what's at stake, what benefits relationships confer, what risks they entail, and what costs they impose. True alliances are rare. They are relationships between nations that entail broad mutual obligations of assistance for as long as the alliance endures. An alliance may be multilateral or bilateral. Since the major purpose of the defensive alliances is deterrence, they tend to be publicly proclaimed. In its highest form, the members of an alliance agree to operate jointly, often under unified military command. North Atlantic Treaty Organization is the premier example of a multilateral alliance. A fading special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, formed in World War II, has been an exemplary bilateral alliance. So is the U.S. relationship with Australia. The so-called alliance between Britain, America, and the Soviet Union in World War II met none of these criteria. It was not an alliance, but an instance of limited partnership in entente, a commitment to cooperate under particular circumstances for limited purposes for as long as this served common interests. Entente confines both commitments and risks to agreed contingencies rather than leaving them open-ended. Unlike alliances, limited partnerships pursuant to entente rely on policy coordination and parallel actions, not joint operations or unified commands. Like alliances, when they're public, ententes, I don't know, we got this thing here. I guess we're about to be assaulted by Apple, which is not unusual. Let's see. There we are. So we'll never know what that would have done. Like alliances, when they're public, ententes deter challenges to the interests of their participants. When they're aggressive rather than defensive, however, they're often kept secret to maximize strategic ambiguity, prospects for entrapment of foes, or surprise. The common purposes that ententes embrace are temporary or conditional, not durable or broad. Both Brits and Russians grasped the distinction between alliance and entente. Americans did not. This contributed to serious American strategic misjudgments that left the United States unprepared for post-war tensions. When these tensions could no longer be ignored, a domestic Red Scare that threatened American liberties ensued. Other examples of U.S. participation in ententes date back to the beginning of our republic. They include the Franco-American Conditional and Defensive Alliance, Traité d'Alliance Éventuelle et Défensive, of February 6, 1778, that ultimately enabled decisive French support for American independence. Sino-American cooperation in the containment of the Soviet Union from 1972 to 1989 was another such limited partnership. More recently, we've seen entente find expression in the formation of parallel international and Islamic coalitions to liberate Kuwait from Iraq, 1991, and cooperation between the United States, China, France, Germany, and Russia to produce the Iran nuclear accord in 2015. Anyone who mistook these expedient arrangements for the durable commitments to cooperation inherent in alliance was destined to be disillusioned. Exchanges of concrete benefits, like base or transit rights, are also often called alliances. They are not, nor are they ententes. They might more accurately be called protectorates. These are symbiotic relationships in which the protected power seldom feels a sense of obligation to its protector, but recognizes the need to provide it with recompense for its support. Protection may be solidly grounded in the interests of both of the parties to it, but it does not involve reciprocal undertakings. The U.S. commitment to Saudi Arabia is an example of such a protectorate. It was briefly elevated to an entente when Saddam Hussein's Iraq attempted to annex Kuwait, and the United States sought its withdrawal in cooperation with the Saudis and other Arab partners. These days, relations with the kingdom involve Saudi purchases of weapons, as well as military training and support services from the United States, Saudi facilitation of U.S. overflight of its strategically positioned territory, and coordinated, but notably not joint, intelligence and anti-terrorist operations. In return, the United States backs Saudi national security policies, even when it considers them dubious, as in Yemen. Ironically, not so long ago, it was the Saudis who found themselves supporting U.S. policies in which they didn't believe, like the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Other prominent examples of U.S. protectorates misdescribed as alliances are Japan and South Korea. Japan emerged from defeat and occupation to become a great economic power. It provides bases and logistical support that are essential to U.S. power projection around the world. The Republic of Korea, or ROK, survived war with other Koreans and their Chinese protectors to become a wealthy and powerful state. Despite their affluence and self-defense capabilities, both Japan and South Korea rely on protection from the United States. They are consumers of American security services with no reciprocal obligations to the United States at all. As such, they are strategic dependents, not direct providers of security to a sometimes paternalistic America. Neither has any obligation to help defend Americans in times of need. It's significant that Japanese-American relations now seem to be evolving away from dependency and toward entente. In the future, as independent Japanese strategic perspectives and capabilities continue to emerge, Japan may assume a greater role in supporting the United States in carefully defined contingencies. If so, of course, Tokyo will demand an equal voice in setting the agenda for U.S.-Japan cooperation. Neither Japan nor the United States is yet prepared for that. By contrast with alliances, ententes, and protectorates, client-state relationships are based on a one-way flow of support from the patron state nation to the client. Client states owe no allegiance and benefits to their patrons. The misuse of the word ally to describe them implies honor-bound mutual obligations that do not exist. Client states add no significant power of their own, political, economic, military, or cultural, to that of their patrons, though they may add base and transit rights or other facilities that improve the geopolitical circumstances of those patrons. Sometimes they're clients only because their independence frustrates a strategic rival, and it's therefore desirable to guarantee it. Client states typically have enemies, otherwise they wouldn't be seeking backing or protection by an external power. Sometimes their enemies are also adversaries of their patron, sometimes not. In any event, client states are hostage to regional forces that are often foreign to the interests of their patrons. The very dependency and vulnerability of client states gives them some degree of leverage over their patrons. They have the freedom to scheme, to get a patron into unwanted battles with others, or to burden it with requirements for diplomatic or material support at the expense of its own objectives and interests. Client states in the Middle East, like Egypt, Israel, and Jordan, enjoy and have received enormous strategic support from the United States. Egypt, which occupies a key bottleneck in strategic lines of communication between Asia and Europe, allows American overflights as a courtesy rather than as an obligation. Others, though notably not Israel, given its lack of acceptance and connections in the region, provide the United States with logistical support for power projection. But none feel obliged to do anything at all in return for the United States, in exchange for the American backing that they receive. These are relationships grounded in self-interest. They are not the product of affection or loyalty, whatever their domestic U.S. supporters may assert. As Egypt showed its former patron, the Soviet Union, in the early 1970s, client states are quite capable of switching allegiance when they believe doing so might benefit them. Today, Egypt is once again in the process of repositioning itself between Russia and the United States. Israel has been at odds with the United States on many policies, but Washington's unflinching support for it continues to enable it to ignore American interests as it pursues its own. Israel, too, is now diluting its dependence on America by developing closer ties with other great powers like Russia, China, and India. Meanwhile, Jordan is taking on some of the characteristics of a U.S. protectorate, as it furnishes bases and facilities to U.S. forces and intelligence agencies engaged in war, illegal war, I might add, in neighboring Syria. But Jordan, too, is pursuing strategic ties to Russia. Some flourishing bilateral relationships are, of course, based on transactional exchanges of benefits, free of any particular implied obligation. As examples, Singapore and India separately see it as in their interest for the United States Navy to remain a nearby presence. To this end, Singapore cooperates with the United States, allowing American naval vessels to use its port facilities on an ongoing pay-as-you-go basis. India has begun to buy U.S. weaponry to exercise with the U.S. Navy and to couch its rivalry with China in terms calculated to appeal to Americans. Singapore is close and attentive to Washington. Delhi keeps its distance, despite its presumed ideological affinities with the United States as a fellow democracy. But neither country has compromised its independence, and neither should be described as an ally, entente partner, protectorate, or client state of the United States. From the dawn of the American Republic, the key task of U.S. foreign policy has been to foster an international order conducive to continued life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness at home. For its first 15 decades, the United States aspired to advance this objective through vigorous expansion across the North American continent, hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, equal opportunity exploitation of markets in Asia, and a combination of example setting and lofty talk about international trends and events. Americans accepted George Washington's insight that alliances were entangling hazards to diplomatic navigation, as well as IOUs that others might call at any time they chose. Until 1945, the United States avoided any sort of relationship with foreigners that entailed defined obligations. Then a new bipolar world order set in. In the Cold War, nations, for the most part, clung to their respective positions in relation to the competing United States and Soviet Union. There were, of course, notable exceptions. Cuba switched from American client state to Soviet protectorate. France withdrew from formal participation in its alliance with the United States through NATO, but retained a relationship of entente with both. The United States downgraded its relations with Taipei from entente to protectorate in order to pursue cooperation with the rival regime in Beijing. Egypt famously switched patrons. Iran turned on its American protector. Despite the overall strategic immobility and diplomatic trench warfare that it exemplified, the Cold War was not entirely without dramatic paradigm shifts. President Richard Nixon's 1972 outreach to China and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat's 1977 embrace of Israel exemplified diplomatic breakthroughs through grand gestures aimed at building new strategic relationships. Such grand diplomacy seeks to bypass fruitless bargaining over insuperable but arguably petty differences with an adversary. Its purpose is to enable the two sides to make a fresh start at seeking common ground, to begin a process of expanded strategic cooperation to mutual advantage, and to defer apparently intractable problems until more favorable conditions for resolving them can emerge. By traveling to the enemy's capital, while making no specific demands of it, Nixon and Sadat, each in his own way, followed Churchill's advice to appease the weak but defy the strong. Each gave his longtime adversary the crucial psychological satisfaction of being treated with respect. Each implicitly acknowledged the legitimacy of his opponent's national security concerns and the need eventually to address them. Grand diplomatic gestures are gifts that call for grand responses, not haggling. Nixon's gesture enabled the United States and China to end 2 decades of fruitless bickering over various sore points in Sino-American relations. China famously takes the long view. China opened to the strategic relationship Nixon sought. By contrast, Israel is notoriously focused on immediate advantage, with little attention to long-term consequences for relations with neighbors, all of which it believes are implacably anti-Semitic. Menachem Begin responded to Sadat's unilateral gesture by attempting to bargain over details. It took Jimmy Carter's intervention at Camp David to persuade Israel to accept the normalized relations Egypt's leader had offered. Though the immediate results of their maneuvers were different, Nixon's and Sadat's breakthrough diplomacy illustrates an important canon of statecraft. When there appears to be no effective answer to a question, one should consider whether the question one has been asking is the wrong one. Elsewhere, and there's a link in the text of this if you're interested, I have described the capacity of diplomacy that changes the capacity of diplomacy that changes the operative questions to change the calculus of other nations to conform to ours. I will not repeat that analysis. In the case of China, if the issue was how to contain and retard its development, a policy of strategic distraction through support for Taiwan and Tibetan separatists, diplomatic embargo, and economic and financial sanctions, as well as military deterrence, made sense. But if the question was how to use China to offset Soviet power, or how to limit the menace of Mao's revolution to world order, acceptance of its government's legitimacy, diplomatic engagement, and promotion of trade and investment were appropriate. If the issue was how to prevent the consolidation of a Western-backed Jewish state on Arab land, Egyptian ostracism and confrontation with Israel were logical policies. But if the question was how to develop the Egyptian economy in partnership with the United States and under conditions of peace, engaging and establishing a modus vivendi with Israel was essential. Today, the impasses between the United States and North Korea, as well as Russia, invite a change in the questions on which American policies have been based. The same is true of China. What is it we want to accomplish with these countries? Our interactions with each are now as barren and dispiriting as those with China before the Nixon opening, or between Egypt and Israel before the Sadat initiative. What if we have the strategic questions wrong? In the case of North Korea, diplomacy has been complicated by Washington's failure to appreciate the deterioration of Pyongyang's relationship with Beijing, or its implications. The relationship between the two has devolved from protectorate to client state to non-committal and strained. But despite its now purely transactional relations with Pyongyang, Beijing has a continuing interest in avoiding both North Korean enmity and in precluding the presence of a potential enemy like the United States in the northern half of the Korean Peninsula. The primary purpose of North Korea's nuclear weapons program has been to develop a deterrent to possible American rather than Chinese attack. Given these realities, American attempts to outsource our problems with North Korea to China have always represented wishful thinking rather than coherent strategy. Perhaps the right question was never how to force Pyongyang to abandon its nuclear program, but how to convince it that it was secure enough from the possibility of American-instigated regime change to have no need for a nuclear program. And maybe the right question with Russia was not how to wall it off from Europe, but how to give it a stake in peaceful coexistence with the European Union, how to nurture mutually advantageous interdependence between the EU and Russia, and how to incorporate Russia into a new European security architecture by interposing buffer states between it and NATO. How might NATO and the EU best promote shared prosperity and security for all Europeans, including Russians? If the redivision of Europe by military confrontation and low-intensity conflict in its borderlands does not serve American, European, or Russian interests, what are the alternatives? Maybe the issue with Ukraine is not how to deny Russia an influential relationship with it, but how to give Moscow a stake in the emergence of a viable, prosperous, independent, and neutral Ukrainian state that can serve as both a buffer and a bridge between Russia and NATO. Perhaps the issues with China are not how to prevent it from overshadowing the United States in the Indo-Pacific, how to confront it militarily, how to deny it influence in neighboring countries, and how to minimize its role in global governance. Maybe the challenges are how to leverage rising Chinese prosperity and scientific prowess to our own benefit, how to institutionalize relationships between China, the United States, and other Asian countries that reinforce regional peace and stability, and how to work with China to address global issues and manage the global commons. If the questions are changed, the policy answers to them change too. In the Cold War, Nixon's and Sadat's exceptional statecraft notwithstanding, diplomacy for the most part resembled trench warfare, with confrontations along well-established fronts that seldom moved. The purpose of diplomacy in that era was to hold the line and prevent intrusions by each superpower into the other's sphere of influence. Each side sought to exploit local strife, as in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Angola, Mozambique, and Afghanistan, to its advantage. But neither was willing to provoke war with the other that might escalate to the nuclear level. Struggles between them took the form of proxy wars. Within their respective spheres of influence, diplomacy was a form of imperial administration, holding subordinate states and politicians in line and trying to mitigate the disunity their quarrels brought to their bloc. We're now in a new and far more fluid and arguably much more dangerous era. Spheres of influence are more porous than ever before. Transactionalism is spreading. Alliances are eroding, and with them the predictability they provide. The limited and temporary partnerships characteristic of Entente are multiplying. Protectorates are losing credibility. Client states are increasingly unconstrained and dismissive of their patrons. Doubt and hedging had begun to replace trust and commitment in international relations before Donald Trump was elected President of the United States 16 months ago on a platform of ungracious nationalism. Since then, doubt and hedging have become omnipresent. The uncertainties agitating other great and middle-ranked powers are now acute. By suggesting that the American commitment to NATO members and other allies was contingent on their reimbursing the cost to the United States of deterring attacks on them, President Trump signaled an apparent willingness to downgrade these allies to protectorates, or even client states. That was, of course, before the blob contrived to have the president's agenda swallowed by the swamp. Mr. Trump's subsequent partial assimilation by the military-industrial congressional complex has not erased Europe's newly aroused anxieties about dependence on America for its defense. Japan and others in Asia have similar concerns, though for the most part they're too polite or cautious to voice them. The norms of rule-bound behavior, so carefully crafted into the United Nations Charter, the Geneva Conventions, and other multilateral agreements like the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, are being set aside. International law no longer constrains powerful nations from invading or dismembering others, overtly or covertly intervening to change their governments, assassinating their citizens, or unilaterally disrupting their commerce. Today, expediency overrides principle. The ends justify the means, and might substitutes for right. Meanwhile, the United States remains caught in Afghanistan, Iraq, and a steadily expanding list of other strategic sinkholes and pitfalls. Its original reasons for invading these places long satisfied or forgotten. The blowback continues to mount from these misadventures as radicalized, aggrieved Muslims seek reprisal. We're caught in a vicious cycle of reciprocally escalating hatred and violence. As a consequence, we Americans are cutting constitutional corners and debasing the due process that is the heart of our Bill of Rights. This imperils our domestic tranquility and freedom, even as it lowers our moral standing abroad. We've now declared our intention to focus our defense planning on fighting militant Islamism, Russia, and China. But we have developed no political or economic strategy for dealing with these challenges by measures short of war. We Americans are sinking ever deeper into debt, with ever less to show for it. We need a period of peace, a timeout from perpetual warfare, to address a widening range of problems at home. It's time to ask what strategy might best foster an international environment in which Americans can confidently expect to enjoy the civil liberties that are our most precious heritage, as well as prosperity, domestic tranquility, and personal security. The sole remaining purpose of our wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria appears to be avoiding having to admit defeat. These wars are costly in blood and treasure. They raise rather than reduce the danger of terrorist attacks on Americans at home and abroad. No one can explain what they are now about, still less how, after 17 years of U.S. engagement in Afghanistan, 15 in Iraq, and nearly 7 in Syria, they will end, and on what terms. Our continuing participation in them is convincing evidence of American obstinacy, not our strategic acumen. It does nothing to enhance the credibility of either our leadership or our military power. The reinforcement of failure is always a mistake unless it is a tactical move linked to a strategic advance toward a broader goal. No one has made the case that serious American strategic interests are now at stake in any of these wars. No strategy depends on their outcome. No alliance stands or falls on it. These wars are all in need of achievable objectives that, once accomplished, could justify ending the U.S. role in them. America is caught in a sunk costs trap. Our generals and their admirers are determined to carry on with failed interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Syria because of the time, money, and blood Americans have poured into these misadventures, not because they have any expectation at all of success. By this logic, the more we fail, the more blood and treasure we must commit. This is not just financially ruinous, it is madness. Afghans are handsome, charming people and redoubtable warriors. But the United States has never had anything to gain from alliance, entente, protection, or the establishment of a client state relationship with Afghanistan. The sole American interest there has been strategic denial, first to the Soviet Union and then to Arab terrorists with global reach. Some Americans may well have strong opinions about how Afghans should govern themselves, but these convictions do not justify a war. The United States has nothing to gain from involving ourselves in the contention between India and Pakistan that fuels Afghan instability. Americans need to remember why we got into Afghanistan in the first place, if we're ever going to get out of it. The basic mission of the U.S. intervention to overthrow the Taliban regime in 2001 was to convince Afghans that they could not afford to host Al-Qaeda or another similar Islamist terrorist group. After losing about 150,000 dead over the 17 years of the American invasion and attempted pacification of their country, Afghans have been left in no doubt about this. With our original mission accomplished, it's time for the United States to roll back mission creep and leave Afghanistan on terms that will make it clear that we will be prepared to resume military action against anti-American terrorists there or in Pakistan if we deem that necessary in future. Deterrence can and should replace American boots on the ground in southwestern Asia. The U.S. war on Islamist militants in Afghanistan was the precursor to overt and covert interventions, drone campaigns, and other forms of warfare in Iraq, Somalia, Libya, Syria, and 70 other countries. Far from reducing the threat of jihadi terrorism, these campaigns in the Muslim world have become the major stimulus for terrorism and the major justification for it, both at home and abroad. The thesis that, quote, we must fight them over there or fight them, whoever they are, here, is demonstrably nonsense. It is precisely because we are over there that they are over here. This feedback loop must be broken for Americans to enjoy affordable security. The grievances that drive anti-American terrorism cannot be cured by military means. They are political and require political solutions. Intensifying schisms within Islam, especially Sunni Islam, are part of the problem. The United States is singularly ill-equipped to deal with these. That must be done through entente with Muslim partners. Saudi Arabia's new emphasis on religious tolerance and combating extremist ideology, and its membership, its leadership of the 41-member Islamic military coalition to combat terrorism, makes it a logical candidate for this role in partnership with Europeans as well as Americans. Meanwhile, a rebalance in U.S. relations with NATO allies Japan and South Korea is long overdue. These countries, prostrate at the outset of the Cold War, have long since recovered their wealth and power. It's time for them to assume greater responsibility for their own defense against external adversaries and internal terrorists. They will not do so if the United States continues to configure and deploy its forces so as to be able to fight their battles without them. The Trump administration has just designated Russia and China as strategic adversaries. Both have noticed this and are responding. Russia is a regional great power that remains traumatized by the Nazi invasion, the collapse of the Soviet Union and its empire, the indifference with which the United States greeted its effort to embrace the liberal international order, and the humiliation of ongoing Western denigration of its power and influence. It fears American efforts to develop the capability to decapitate its leadership with a nuclear first strike, engineer regime change in Moscow, and establish a hostile military presence on its central and southern borders, in addition to its northwestern Baltic borders, where NATO is, of course, currently entrenching itself. Moscow's principal defense against American hostility, which is something we should think about, is the deterrent value of its enormous nuclear arsenal, which could destroy the United States, and with it much, maybe all, of the world. Short of Armageddon, Russia seeks to change U.S. policies that menace it, and to ensure that it's protected from the United States and its European allies by friendly buffer states in Belarus and Ukraine. The United States and much of Europe view this in mirror image terms as assertively aggressive Russian behavior. This image is buttressed by Russian agitprop and disinformation campaigns targeted at the electoral choices of voters in the West. It builds on reactions to Russia's opportunistic responses to backlash by Russian speakers in Ukraine against Ukrainian ethno-linguistic chauvinism. Russia is not the originator of the digital video, social media, and other hallucinogenic information technologies that have ushered in an age of unreason in the West. But as the Russian state has joined advertising companies, Cambridge Analytica, I guess, and political spin doctors in learning how to exploit Western neuroses and psychoses through these technologies. The celebrity politics and the rot in civil literacy, civility, reality-based analysis, and policy dialogue now affecting democratic societies have greatly enhanced the marginal utility of Russian agitprop. American vulnerability to this cannot be remedied by defense budget plus-ups, bluster and shows of force, sanctions, arms transfers, or denunciatory diplomacy. The only effective answer is to strengthen civil society, buttress the rule of law, and reinforce democratic norms here at home. But we must also understand and abate the factors stimulating Russian rancor and pugnacity. Russia's aim is not to discredit democracy per se, nor is China's. Each is defending its interests as it sees them against threats it perceives, not making an ideological point. Both countries entered post-ideological phases a quarter century ago. But based on recent experience, neither sees Western democracy as likely to best the performance of its own form of autocracy. China, in particular, is content to let Western systems of government discredit themselves while it gets on with its own development. The appeal of our political systems will fall, and theirs will rise to the extent that we in the West fail to address the mounting anxiety of our citizens over stagnant wages, increasingly unjust income distribution, entrenched inequality of opportunity, declining domestic tranquility and personal safety, wrenching changes in social norms and institutions, and the like. Better performance on our part is key. But we should also examine our policies to reduce the extent to which they feed Russian fears and Chinese apprehensions. The misapprehensions of American military capabilities and intentions stoked by our recent statements of our national security posture do not serve our interests. China is fully integrated into the global and regional economies. It cannot be contained. America is being eclipsed economically in an increasingly Sino-centric Asia. China is too big and potentially too powerful to be balanced by its neighbors, individually or collectively. American military primacy along China's borders is as unsustainable as European primacy along America's borders proved to be as the 20th century began. The United States will either coexist with China in the Western Pacific or be pushed back by it. The United States has the political, economic, and military heft to help China's neighbors accommodate its power on terms that make them full participants in the management of the Indo-Pacific region's economy, security, and politics, and avoid Chinese domination. If China's neighbors, especially Japan, assume much greater responsibility for their own defense, build regional coalitions, and enlist American support for a more independent and self-reliant stance than in the past, U.S. dominance of the region's affairs need not be followed by Chinese hegemony. China is, of course, not just an Indo-Pacific power, but a rising presence on the entire Eurasian landmass and in adjacent areas. Its Belt and Road Initiative is a bold move to connect all of Eurasia from the Azores to the Bering Strait, from Arkhangelsk to Colombo, in a single new geoeconomic zone. There's no feasible American military retort to this grand strategy. The parlous state of American finances precludes an economic response to it. You can't beat something with nothing. China's connectivity initiative requires a geopolitical answer. The example of American participation in European affairs seems relevant. The U.S. presence in Europe helps to offset the otherwise natural dominance of Germany, to allay the concerns of smaller countries about German ascendancy, and to facilitate pan-European cooperation. Similarly, American participation in Eurasian rulemaking and implementation in cooperation with Europe, Japan, and others, as well as China, could temper and offset Chinese influence, relieve the concerns of smaller countries about Chinese power, and facilitate confident transnational cooperation among the nations of the supercontinent. We're clearly entering a new phase of history, but the key challenge of U.S. foreign policy remains how to foster an international order conducive to the continued life, liberty, could someone turn that back on? And the pursuit of happiness at home. These purposes are best served by a peaceful international environment. Nurturing such an environment requires a diplomatic strategy of relationship and coalition building that is more than purely military. This is especially the case when, as now, the power of others, military as well as economic, is growing relative to that of the United States. Americans have a strategic interest in sustaining international law as a reassurance to other countries that they need not arm themselves with nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction to defend themselves against us or other stronger nations. The United States has a vital interest in addressing the causes of potential conflicts, not just deterring their outbreak and allowing them to worsen unattended. Americans need to prevent adversaries from becoming enemies and to preclude the formation of coalitions against us. To enjoy affordable security, we must rebuild and develop America's competence at diplomacy as well as at warfighting. This effort must begin with efforts, I believe, to restore precision to our diplomatic terminology and reasoning processes, to sharpen our analysis of international realities, and to rediscover diplomacy as strategy. To this end, we should focus on the development of diplomatic doctrine, a teachable body of interrelated operational concepts that enable us to use all elements of our power to influence the behavior of other states and peoples by measures short of war. We can do this if we rediscover diplomatic history and develop case studies that make its lessons accessible to practitioners. We have a military establishment, as I said, of unprecedented professionalism and competence, but many, if not most, of the challenges we face are not military or subject amenable to military solutions. Excellence in diplomacy is at least as essential to the future of our country as is excellence in the conduct of military operations. The leveling of legacy institutions like the United States Department of State and the Foreign Service by the Trump administration promises to offer an opportunity to begin anew. We must begin to prepare the way to enable a future administration to seize that opportunity. Thank you. I think I'm going to sit down, if I may. Being old and creaky. So I'd be glad to entertain comments or questions. Yes, sir.
Two questions. Do you think Mike Pompeo is going to get confirmed? And if he is confirmed, do you think there's even a chance in hell that he is going to address any of the issues that you summarized at the very end of your talk?
Yes and no. He will be confirmed, and no, he is not the person to address these issues. There is a fundamental problem with the process of professionalization that I was outlining. Somebody's too quick on the draw, I think. And it is the spoil system. Mr. Pompeo is a very bright man, no doubt. First in his class mechanical engineering degree at West Point. One of the editors of the Harvard Law Review when he was in law school. Very articulate. He also has views which are quite different from anybody internationally. And he has what is described as good chemistry with the president, which means he never disagrees with the president, which is not what a Secretary of State is supposed to do. But he inherits a department which has been broken. 12% of the Foreign Service has already left. A large group is on the way out. The senior ranks have been depleted. The intake is restricted. People are not being replenished. The people are leaving are people with decades worth of language and cultural communication experience experience in diplomacy, which is the art of persuading other people to do things our way. And to the extent they're replaced at all, they're replaced with people, no experience, no foreign language, nothing. So we have, I think, the figure of 130 key positions in the foreign policy establishment is the right figure. 65 don't even have a nominee in process. The number of vacancies is vastly larger. Those whom Tillerson managed to put in, very few by the way, will be leaving. It appears that Mr. Pompeo may, as one of his first acts, undo the appointment of Susan Thornton as Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific. She's a career officer, a very fine one. Can you imagine taking command of a military operation and your first act is to fire the most distinguished professionals in the group? What that does to morale, if there is any morale. When I worked at the Department of State, and I'm sure others here had similar experience, if you walked the corridors at 6:30 in the morning or at 7:30 or 8 at night, people were working. People are leaving at 4 in the afternoon now. This is an organization that's basically been broken. So, there's a difference between pessimists and optimists. Pessimists think things can't possibly get any worse. Optimists think, sure, they can get worse. And I'm an optimist in this context. But I think we will hit bottom at some point, and we need to be thinking about how we make up for what we're doing. How do we train people to do the jobs that the experienced people who are leaving once knew how to do? How to train them to do those jobs better. Let's take this as an opportunity. But I'm sorry to say at an academic institution that international relations theory is interesting but largely irrelevant to the practice of diplomacy. Conflict studies, conflict resolution and management studies come closer, but they don't address the question of when you encounter this situation, what are the options that you should consider? How should you consider this question? And this is what you do. The first year of law school, this is what they teach you, how to think like a lawyer. And of course, you're then forever damned. You'll never. But we need to be thinking about the pedagogy of the profession.
The microphone's a little hard to hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Should there be a United States Academy of International Affairs, something similar to the military academies?
It's very interesting. In the legislative session in 1796, I believe, a bill was introduced to establish a diplomatic equivalent of West Point. That bill was reintroduced with every Congress up until sometime, I don't remember the date, but 60s or 70s, when it passed, and it created not a diplomatic training institution, but a government think tank called the United States Institute of Peace, which is a fine institution, has a beautiful building overlooking the Potomac, and doesn't answer the problem. 32% proposed cut in the foreign affairs budget, at the same time that the Defense Department budget and related budgets were plussed up by more than the total amount of the foreign affairs budget, existing one. That's why I mentioned other people are not doing this, like the Chinese. They literally doubled their budget just now for foreign affairs. They've set up an aid agency, which they never had. We're going out of business in the foreign assistance area. They're getting into it. That tells you something about the direction of events.
Just a quick question. to follow up with that, because we know we're historically, if not aggressively, competitive, so why don't we use that as motivation for us? The Chinese are passing us in diplomacy.
Well, look, we're living in a country that has just doubled down on paying for daily government operations by increasing the credit rollovers. We have a long-term financial plan which consists of rolling over debt at higher and higher levels forever. That is why the debt is going up. We just passed a tax program misdescribed as tax reform, which basically increased deficit spending. Instead of raising the national savings rate to be able to invest in competition, research and development, infrastructure that improves efficiency within the economy, human infrastructure, retraining workers, looking at the labor management system to see whether it can be corrected so that corporate management does not respond to competition by firing workers and outsourcing, but responds as they do in Germany by looking at automation and retraining the existing workforce. Lots of things we could do. What we have is Brownian motion in Washington. Nobody has a strategy. Nobody's willing to put any money behind anything. We have an infrastructure program grandly announced with no money. Yes, that's what we should be doing. Americans should be motivated by a leader who, instead of whining about everybody taking advantage of us, says we have to do better. You don't win games by whining. Yes, you ask exactly the right question. Sorry.
So, do you have any advice for with the preparation, like that you've talked about with like a new State Department, things like that, for young people who want to go into politics and international affairs? Do you have any advice for how we can prepare ourselves?
I don't think the preparation for public service is really any different. It's going to be any different in the future than it has been. This is a bad time for public service. The exodus from the federal workforce, I think, is up 17 or 18% this year over normal years. We're losing an awful lot of people we shouldn't be losing. And you will see this in the form of less efficient government services, more bureaucracy, and so forth. Not less. How should you prepare yourself? If you're thinking about the Foreign Service or allied professions, CIA, for example, then the preparation consists of getting a very good liberal education, and including becoming familiar with history, not just our own, but history of others. It includes testing your language ability to see whether you can learn languages. And it includes developing communication skills, which you can do, probably not so much in a university, but if you speak at the Rotary Club or something like that. Those characteristics won't change. But there was a time when people joined the federal workforce, the Foreign Service, because they thought it would be a lark. It would, they'd get to go interesting places and do interesting things for a few years, and then they'd drop out and go work on Wall Street. I'm sorry to tell you that that's not going to cut it in the future. You're going to have a real dedication to public service. You're going to have to be a patriot. You're going to have to be willing to sacrifice and try to help rebuild the country, because the country is the country is being disassembled in many respects. So patriotism, public service, selflessness, the desire to do something for others rather than just for yourself. I suspect there are many people who have all those characteristics. Some of them join the military. Yeah.
In your opinion, which countries would you say have the best foreign policy that benefits their respective country?
Pound for pound, Singapore. No question. Why do they have such a good government? They take government seriously. They pay their government employees very well. They don't have any corruption as a result. There's no excuse for corruption in Singapore. And by the way, if you are corrupt in Singapore, you don't last long. Singapore is, it's a very small country between very large ones in a dangerous region, and it's managed. And as I said, it has not compromised its independence, despite efforts by everybody to try to enlist it in one way or another. Others have excellent foreign services, very intelligent foreign policies. I would say at the moment the Russians are very impressive. If you think about it, they think about the performance in Syria and the Middle East. With minimal military investment, they've made themselves the go-to country in the Middle East. They've put themselves at the center of all sorts of things. Everybody understands now. You can't deal with refugee issues without the cooperation of Moscow. You can't try to make peace in Syria without Moscow. The UN can't persuade combatants to stand down, even for a few hours, but Moscow can. And I should say they also showed off their weaponry in a way that's increased their arms market. They demonstrated its capability. And didn't cost them very much. At the height, they had 5,000 personnel in Syria. So this is their operation there, I would say. I hate to say it, but it was a model of political military coordination. I don't want to go on. There are plenty of countries that take foreign affairs seriously and do them well.
Not a lawyer by trade, but one of the hypothetical questions, if all of a sudden you got a call from Washington to participate in the diplomatic solution of what's going on in North Korea, do you have any caveats that you might like to use?
I think North Korea represents, there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the current state of the North Korean issue. The first is we had 65 years from the armistice in 1953, in which we pledged that we would try to replace the armistice with a peace, but we never made any effort to do so. So we dealt with the North Koreans entirely through ostracism, confrontation, shows of force, and deterrence to, wall them up. And we never tried to solve the problem in Korea. What's the problem? Well, everybody's got a different definition of it. But the North Korean definition is vulnerability to external attack and regime change. And by the way, if we pull the plug on the Iran nuclear deal, forget any deal with North Korea, because who will want to deal with us if we are so inconstant? What would I do? Well, let's say the president apparently impetuously, with no staff support, prior discussion, or study, agreed to go meet Kim Jong-un. That's good. Frankly, I think not talking to the North Koreans, which is what we've mostly done, meant that even if we could come up with an idea to resolve the issue, there was no path to it. Perhaps the art of the deal will prevail in this meeting. On the other hand, in order to make a deal, in order to have a summit, usually you have to have some preconditions. You have to know what you want. The other side has to regard that as acceptable. There has to be preparation so that you are, if anything, you're either ratifying work that's been done by your subordinates, or you're pushing it one last inch into an agreement. Now, we have a president who doesn't read, who seemed shocked when Xi Jinping told him something about Korean history at Mar-a-Lago. We have a government in which the senior Korean specialists have all resigned and left. I'm told that the plan is to use CIA channels. The CIA apparently has some sort of relationship with the North Korean Reconnaissance Bureau, which is their equivalent. There's no evidence that that's happening. General McMaster just met in San Francisco with his Japanese and South Korean counterparts to discuss the summit. General McMaster is generally regarded as a proponent of a military assault on North Korea, which is precisely what motivates the North Koreans to want a nuclear deterrent. So this looks to me like a goat rope, to put it politely. I could use other words. I think it's quite a gamble. Whether it actually happens or not is another question. We've seen this president change his mind on all sorts of things. Yes?
Given your current opinion, what is your non-optimistic estimation of the amount of time that it will probably take for us to get back to where we should be, or where you believe we should be, assuming there's no Trump 2 to kick the boulder back down the hill?
Well, let us remind ourselves that removing regimes does not replace them. If we did that in Baghdad. If Mr. Trump is removed from office by impeachment or by elections, we don't know who's going to succeed him. Well, we do if he's impeached. That's Mike Pence. You can think about that. At least the women in the audience will be safe. So let me address your question on two levels. One is, I don't think it's that hard with a change at the top in an election, 2020, and the right person coming in. By the way, where are the candidates? Where is the positive program that is the antidote to the problems that we all know exist? I don't see it. So we get a change of personnel at the top. I think the country will be very ready for a rethink of a lot of issues and to move in a different direction. And I think the problem with the last election was that it was a contest between more of the same and, BS, basically, very effective BS. So on that level, change could come easily. The institutions that have been destroyed, State Department, Foreign Service, EPA, Education Department, you can just go down the list, are going to take 20 years to reestablish. The Army will tell you, I don't know whether Peter Mirasol, who's in the Navy, will agree with this, but the Army will tell you that it takes about 20 years to form a division to the point where people work effectively together. And in my experience, that's the same with government departments. The Defense Department, created in 1947, did not become effective until around 1962. And Homeland Security, created in 2003, still is not working together. So The institutions will require a lengthy period of reconstruction, which is why I think we need to think about how to train the people to run them while we're in this period of confusion. I don't know whether that's optimistic or pessimistic.
Well, aside from the current situation, historically, for example, Hillary Clinton was quoted about Baker, Bush, and Reagan were all promising not to expand NATO. Her famous quip was, well, it wasn't in writing. She was a trained lawyer. So I'm not sure if training in law school is necessarily the best
No, there's
form of diplomacy.
I'm sure you know the story of the guy who dies and ends up in heaven, and he's interviewed by God, and God says, well, who are you and what do you do? And he says, I'm an engineer. And God says, well, you're going to hell. I'm going to assign you there. So he goes down to hell, and after a few years, hell has got flush toilets and hot and cold running water in the showers and air conditioning, and everything is looking up. And God and the devil have a conversation. And the devil says, you know, that's a hell of an engineer you sent me. And God says, well, engineer, I sent an engineer to you. That was a mistake. I want him back. The devil says, sue me. God says, I will. And the devil says, where are you going to find a lawyer? Anyway, so I'm sorry I interrupted you.
You know, highly visible Americans basically say, well, if you don't have it in writing, and diplomatic history is filled with verbal corollaries that undergirded written treaties.
Yeah, actually, the National Archives project at George Washington University 2 days ago, released the documents that record the discussions between the George H.W. Bush administration and Gorbachev and the Russians. And it's very clear what was said. So whether it was, quote, in writing or not makes no difference. That is the sort of quibble that gives lawyers a really bad name.
Right, but how do you regain trust after 20 years of that, you know?
Not easily. You know, I think one of the lessons that you learn in the course of a diplomatic career is that once trust is forfeited, it's almost impossible to restore it. I don't want to give earthy examples of this, but if there is a problem in a marriage that destroys trust, how soon does it come back? So I think it's a real problem. And, you know, you can't go around saying, well, Obama did it. You know, that's irrelevant. The question is, what are you going to do, and are you trustworthy? Mr. Trump internationally has a reputation for being totally untrustworthy. So it's clearly not going to happen on his watch. Yes, he's worked at it. So, yes.
I have a question about Xi and China having power now for life, perhaps.
Right.
What are your thoughts?
Well, the justification for this is the usual one, namely that there is an agenda that needs to be pushed through, and that if people are focused on a change of leadership 5 years from now, the agenda will be derailed. It will not be possible to get it through because people will be maneuvering politically and for advantage. That's the usual, you know. So here's the reality. There is an agenda that needs to be pushed through. Major economic reform that steps on a lot of toes in vested interests in China. That's true. What we don't know is whether the explanation of the removal of term limits is, in fact, that those toes will now get stepped on by somebody who feels confident that he doesn't face a deadline for stepping down, or whether that's just a rationalization. So I always remember having served in lots of places with presidents for life and that sort of thing. The comment of George III, who was not a great admirer of American independence, when he was told that George Washington was going to retire to the farm at the end of his second term, and he said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. Knowing when to leave is the key to greatness in history very often. And we have 2 minutes before I have to leave.
I wonder if the occurrences, in following up that question, the occurrences that are happening in China and seemingly in Russia, as well as other states, indicate to some extent that democracy is losing out to autocracy on a global basis, and what that means, and what you think the significance of that. I don't care what anybody else thinks. I'm more interested in what you think.
The problem is autocracy is outperforming democracy. So, and democracy is ill. It's ill, it's sick. We are not producing intelligent decisions, or any decisions very often, in a timely basis. Our system is gridlocked. It is also widely seen as very venal and corrupt. People buy votes. No one asserts a national interest. Everybody asserts a particular interest. Sometimes out of belief, but frankly, more often than not, because that's key to campaign contributions. So we have a system that doesn't integrate decisions in a healthy manner. We have a president who is not admired internationally. We have a Congress that is not admired domestically. We have a Supreme Court that some people describe as off its meds. Off its meds. And so if you don't set an example of effective governance, what do you expect? I happen to believe that citizen participation in decision making, which is the essence of democracy, is essential for many reasons, and it solves lots of problems in political systems. But it's very hard to make the case now that it's producing better decisions than are being made by autocrats. So what's the answer? It's the same answer that I gave earlier. We have to pull our socks up, get our act together, and compete. We have to recognize that blaming other people for our problems is not going to solve them. Those problems are here. They're made by us. So that's what I think. I think we should be defending democracy by making it work.
Some of the concepts that have been brought up here, including law and democracies. Of course, the concepts are good, but the practice has been allowed to slide. When we look to law, we see we don't get justice. We get very obsessive adversity, which was legislative process is supposed to arrive at justice, but we do not get it. And the one you left out is business. And business is just has turned into a bottom line, yet another obsession, so that there still remains international notorious wealth inequity.
I think we have a problem that we need to review. The basis of our system is a belief in process, due process. Process legitimizes outcomes. That is how this country is organized. A deliberative process in the Congress for legislation, a judicial process of dispute resolution in the courts. But most people now seem to believe that outcomes justify and legitimize decisions, not the process. And that is anti-democratic because elections are meant to be the process by which we select our leaders. And it is ultimately delegitimizing for the courts and everyone else. And it doesn't, you know, if we get the wrong outcomes, which we increasingly seem to, that exacerbates the problem. Internationally, as I said, international law is on the skids. Who put it there? We had a lot to do with it. The invasion of Iraq was totally illegal. The separation of Kosovo from Serbia, from Yugoslavia, was totally illegal. We said it didn't set a precedent, but Mr. Putin thought it did, and used that precedent in Crimea. By what right is the United States now stationing troops in Syria? We even asked the Saudis, apparently, for $4 billion to develop parts of Syria that are not under the control of the government. We didn't, these are Kurdish areas. We didn't consult with the Turks either. But where is the principle of sovereignty gone? Where is the principle of collective authorization of international action through the Security Council gone? We build a lot of legal institutions. We're basically not using them. We're trashing them. And the consequences will afflict our posterity. Fortunately, I plan to check out before all this gets too bad. I think we should would bring this to a close. Thank you.